On the 31st of December 2022, minutes before midnight, President Volodymyr Zelensky broadcast his New Year's video message. He wished for victory and for the return of Ukrainian land. But as 2023 ends, it is safe to say none of his wishes have come true. This brutal, miserable war continues to grind on. So, how will 2023 be viewed in history when the story of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is written? That will be our focus for this special programme. We'll examine President Zelensky's thwarted ambition of a spring counter-offensive, look at that march on Moscow, not by Ukrainian forces, but from within Russia's own ranks, and analyse how the international community has responded. And to go through that, two people who've been our expert guides since the war broke out. Security and defence analyst Professor Michael Clarke and former Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell are going to reflect on another year of all-out war in Ukraine and tell us whether 2024 will prove to be any different.
You can make out the damage to the city. There's just smoke across the horizon.
Ukrainian flags, blue for the sky and yellow for the wheat fields, stretch into the distance.
I really don't understand who really make decisions in Russia.
We'll need a long time for crying and for grieving for everyone, that everyone we lost in this war.
We just have some breaking news to bring you now. There's been a plane crash near Moscow. Evgeny Prigozhin was on board.
That is essentially the top echelons of the Wagner Group taken out in one fell swoop.
Look at the size of this cell. No windows, and out of the 19, 9 of them were children.
You're home, 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 she keeps repeating.
There's been an incoming call now, and all the evacuation operations have had to scatter.
Russia's been so reluctant to talk about their casualties, and you don't see these kinds of scenes on Russian state TV.
Let's take a look now at the state of the conflict in January of 2023. The area shaded in red shows the parts of Ukraine under Russian control. Now, as we move through the year, you can see there has been very little change in the front line. Then, as we reach December, the battlefield looked very similar to as it did at the beginning of 2023. Well, let's get the thoughts of our experts. Sean, what was the key moment for you, or the key moments of 2023?
Yeah, Kamali, for me, the big one was that much vaunted spring offensive, so much anticipation and yet so little was ultimately achieved. But I think you have to wind back almost to the previous year. In September of 22, the Ukrainians demonstrated that they could push Russian back. After the Kharkiv push, they managed to liberate 12,000 square kilometres of ground relatively quickly. And that winter, evidently, President Zelensky turned around to the Western world and said, give me the tools, and I can do the job. And you'll recall at the time, the West was very quick to provide anti-tank weapons, defensive weapons to Ukraine, but was much more reluctant to actually swing in and provide longer-range missiles. And remember the discussion around tanks. But the UK stepped forward, said we would put Challenger 2 tanks on the table. Very small numbers, but it was a key moment. Leopard 2 suddenly followed, and then, of course, the Americans followed suit, although it was going to take a little bit longer for their tanks to arrive. But ultimately, it was delayed, the start of that offensive, because all of these weapons, the artillery, the ammunition and the training all had to be put in place. Culminated, it didn't start in spring, started in June, and we can get into that. But at that time, there was a huge amount of anticipation that that was going to be the culminating point, the decisive moment for Ukraine that was going to end up sweeping Russia back. How wrong we were.
Did not occur. Michael, for you, what was your... what was the moment in 2023 for you, you think, that sort of signifies how the war is going?
Yeah, I mean, Sean is absolutely right. I mean, 2023 will go down as the year of the offensive that didn't work. But one other element, which is pretty important as well, I think, was Ukraine's ability to actually get control of the western part of the Black Sea. And again, goes back to what was done over the winter for two reasons. One is that the Ukrainians attacked Sevastopol. They took down the radar sites near Sevastopol. They got inside the harbour. They attacked shipping, Russian shipping, warships and other ships. They attacked at Novorossiysk, which is the port in Russia on the other part of the Black Sea, so much so that the Russians are now trying to open up another port in the Abkhazia area of Georgia, which is a foreign country, but Abkhazia is a breakaway region like Donetsk and Luhansk. They're trying to build another port there. And so the Ukrainians have actually kept the western part of the Black Sea hostile to Russia, so much so that now they've got a corridor for their shipping all the way down the coast, about 100 miles worth of sea, which they can use, and ships are going backwards and forwards. So in that respect, the control of the western part of the Black Sea is really important. And the other way in which it was important is it showed that the Ukrainians could innovate. They did this partly with these sea babies, these little drones, these kamikaze submarines, semi-submersibles, that they developed themselves. 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds worth of explosives in them, you know, relatively basic navigation system, and they made it too hot for, you know, old-fashioned but very powerful Russian warships. And that's a sign of the future, because as this war goes on, the ability to innovate will be one of the competitive elements between Russia and Ukraine. And Ukraine has shown they're good at innovation. So that is some encouragement for the future.
It is. And that innovation, Sean, I mean, that kind of plays into the counteroffensive on land, doesn't it? Because these Ukrainian troops were trained by NATO forces, by the United States and by Britain, and there was some debate while the counteroffensive was stalling, that some of those tactics that they'd been trained on weren't relevant for the battlefield in which they found themselves.
One of the challenges, I think, is that the Russian way of fighting is highly attritional. Just throw lots of bodies at the fight and eventually you'll prevail. Ukraine had to be really careful not to get dragged into that sort of fight, because ultimately, if in a war of attrition, the bigger side will win, and Russia was the bigger side. So one advantage that the West was able to provide was technology. One of the things that we learned at the end of the Second World War was that we never wanted to see that sort of huge number of casualties again. And therefore, how do you use technology to your advantage? And a good example of that was the counter-battery radars that were provided by the West. Normally, Russia would just sit all day putting rounds into artillery pieces and firing them, and with relative impunity. All of a sudden now, when the Western counter-battery radar saw this round come at it, it could pretty accurately work out where that round was coming from and fire a pretty accurate round back. Now, all of a sudden, your Russian soldier is expecting he's not going to have it all his own way. And I think those sorts of things have created a real advantage.
And the Ukrainians added to our NATO counter-battery radars with their own software system. Right. So they could work a sort of a taxi rank system, whereby once they'd located Russian artillery, they could bring in whatever fire was available, whether it was air, drones, land, or something else, and they were able to actually target it within a matter of seconds. That was their own software. It was very powerful at the time. It was a good way of the Ukrainians actually building on something that we'd given them. That's quite encouraging for the future.
Did they ever have enough of that kind of material, though, to be able to make an actual difference?
That's the point. They had enough to get by, but not enough to make a real difference, to undermine the fact that the Russians were going to throw everything into this without any concern, really, for the amount of equipment they lost or the amount of men that they were just pushing through the meat grinder.
And enough to get by, but was there capacity in NATO countries to give them the weapons? I mean, the amount of sort of munitions productions in NATO countries in the West is
there was at the start. There was capacity at the start, but we all knew that there'd be a munitions crisis in the winter. And here we are, there's a munitions crisis because we gave what was easy to give. Now we're down to our own stock, so we're going to give those, well, some but not all, and we cannot reproduce armaments quickly enough until, actually, 2025. I mean, 2024 is a year when nobody has got enough weapons. The Russians haven't, NATO hasn't, the Ukrainians haven't.
One of the other points I think as well is that the West knows that technology is its own asymmetric advantage, so it's reluctant to give its own state-of-the-art weapons. So we actually gave older, still very competent, but older weapons. Those stockpiles have been run pretty low. Things like Storm Shadow missiles are very capable, but they're 30-year-old technology. And the West was not prepared to give her the most modern stuff because, unfortunately, some of it might end up falling onto the black market and therefore into Russian hands.
And that was a real concern of Western governments to not make sure.
We're said to have about 1,000 Storm Shadows. You would know this. How many do you think we gave to Ukraine?
Well, there's an upgrade programme for about 300 or 400. About 200 of the original buy had been used, and therefore it was around about 300, we think, is the sort of number. There may be some more in the wings. The irony of that, of course, is that we knew we were going to have to get rid of them, so we as a nation would have had to pay to decommission them. So by giving them over and they get used, actually, it's a win-win situation.
But we don't want then to give more and eat into our own stocks, even though they're just what the Ukrainians
Well,
need.
there may be some flexibility, but the point being is that we are very reluctant. We're not giving them state-of-the-art weapons, and those other weapons, they were bought 30 years ago. You can't nip down to supermarkets and just buy them. So there's a limited stock, and actually, when you reduce your stock below the level you've agreed, you now take national risk. And that is not, and trust me, as a guy who used to work in the MOD, we didn't ever buy more weapons than we wanted. It was always less than we needed with a degree of risk. So our political masters have taken a significant risk by dropping those levels down further.
Fantastic stuff. All right, guys, let's move on to the two men who are, of course, key to this fight, Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. Let me start with you, Michael. Give us a sense from your perspective how both men have prosecuted this war in 2023.
Well, Zelensky always said, this is a war for survival. We'll do whatever it takes, and we won't expect it to be over soon. And the Ukrainians themselves, they always say, look, this started in 2014. We've been fighting the Russians already for 7 or 8 years before the 2022 invasion. President Putin, we were not sure about, because we said, and I've always said, and I still believe, that he's finished. But whether that takes 6 months or 2 years or 3 years, I don't know. But he's in a blind alley. But because he's in this blind alley, he will commit whatever it takes to it. And he's made Russia more repressive than in the Stalinist era. He's turning the economy of Russia into a war economy, and the Russians will start to feel that from 2024. Next year, they'll have to start to pay for this war in terms of the expenditure that won't be made on health and education and welfare.
Of course, one of the key moments of 2023 was what was described as the March to Moscow, when Yevgeny Prigozhin led a column of mercenaries onwards towards the Russian capital, and it played out from there.
Yeah, nobody was sure what it was. Was it a coup? No, probably not. It was Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner group, who was overreaching himself. He got so frustrated, and he looked as if he was trying to blackmail the Kremlin into getting rid of Shoigu, the defence minister, and putting his choice in place. Sorovikin was thought to be that person. Sorovikin, General Armageddon, as they called him, the man who's responsible for all the defences in the south. He seemed to be not necessarily implicated, but he certainly knew about it beforehand. And this whole thing became quite farcical. So the Wagner group, got to within about 100 miles of Moscow. They sort of went through. It was said with 25,000 people. They didn't. They had about 5,000, and it was a bit of a ragtag process. But Putin was very worried. It looked at the time as if it might be a sort of a crazy, almost carry-on style coup developing. Bottom line is that Putin recovered from it. Prigozhin was killed in an air crash not long afterwards. And Wagner still exists. Troshev seems to be leading the respectable part of it. Utkin was killed in the crash. He was the deputy as well. But Wagner still exists. The Kremlin is in some control of Wagner now, although it's still a bit of a law unto itself. And Putin has recovered his confidence. And so he's got over it. It looked like a big crisis moment, but he got over it.
Let's have a quick thought about Volodymyr Zelensky, if we can. How do you think his war of 2023 has gone from a war leader, a man who, of course, was a comedian in 2019?
Interestingly, as he ends the year, it does look as if there are some experts that are starting to criticise him. If you look back at a man who hadn't got much political experience, has no military experience at all, has been absolutely amazing as a global leader, galvanising Western support. He's been on the global media, drumming up support. Let's be clear, without the Western support, this would have been a very different battle. And he's very successfully, even though Ukraine is not part of NATO, has managed to secure that support, which has been invaluable. I think what we're seeing now is etched on his face is a realism and the fallout between his chief of the military, Valery Zaluzhny, I think betrays there's some really interesting discussions behind the scene at the moment, and it'll be very tough for him at this stage of the year.
I mean, it certainly is. Michael, I mean, how damaging is it going to be to their efforts, their war efforts, that there may well be a fallout between the president and the general?
Oh, they've got to get over it. I mean, there is a governmental crisis
brewing. Can they get over that?
I think they can, but there's a crisis brewing in Kiev, and they've got to get over that for next year, because they can't go into 2024 with a sense that the government is not united, or that Zelensky does not command real support amongst his generals and his officials.
So, guys, let's look ahead then to 2024. Michael, how do you see the war progressing?
There won't be a great deal of strategic change in 2024, probably. The Ukrainians have got to get through the first 6 months of it. without the sort of aid that they have had in the past year. The Russians also, they can't launch a strategic offensive until the spring of 2025 at the earliest, because they just don't have the equipment, and they won't have until they've geared up. The one thing that might change, of course, is that there's an opportunity, possibly, for the Ukrainians in the summer of 2024, if they did get more Western equipment and were able to use it a bit more in a combined arms way than they were last year, then they have an opportunity to hit the Russians before the Russians are really ready. But whether that will take place will rather depend on the politics of the West in an American election year.
Sean, how do you see 2024 playing out?
Yeah, I'm probably a bit more pessimistic, I think, than Professor Clarke, largely because at the start of this conflict, the West's objectives and Ukraine's were aligned. They weren't the same. Ukraine wanted to liberate its country. The West was scared about Russia's threat to Europe. But if you wind the clock forward to today, Ukraine's objectives really haven't changed, still liberate their country, whereas the West, Russia is no longer the threat it posed to Europe anymore. Conservative estimates talk about 10 to 15 years before it would be ready to mount any form of threat to Europe. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and therefore, why would we continue to support a war that potentially, when Ukraine had every support it could have asked for in the spring offensive, didn't move the front lines? What's going to change in the future? So there is a concern that actually, how do you gradually wind this to a compromise that eventually allows the West to focus on rebuilding Ukraine, providing the security guarantees that are required? And it's a very unpalatable conversation about a compromise to this, but ultimately I see there's going to be very limited progress either side, and a frozen war doesn't probably suit anybody.
That's fascinating. Just to pick up on that point a little bit, so the fact that Russia has invaded a neighbour, for military planners in the West and in NATO, the fact they've expended all of this material has made them a diminished threat in some ways?
One of the reasons that the West was happy to reduce its stockpile of weapons, because part of those weapons was set aside for a potential Russian conflict. The fact that Russia now has lost over 2,000 main battle tanks, and exactly as Professor Clarke said, you know, they are no longer in a fit state militarily to mount a credible offensive anytime soon. So all of a sudden now, the West could breathe, and actually the weather vane of the media swung to look at Israel as well and providing military support. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, Sean's exactly right about that. But there's a global point as well, which plays into the sort of the top of what he's saying, which is that the West has committed itself to this war. It has said that we will make sure that Ukraine survives. We will make sure that Putin must fail. And that was a phrase invented by Boris Johnson in London. It's gone around the Western alliance. Putin must fail. And the rest of the world, the global South, is standing back to see what happens. And so if it looks as if we do some sort of grubby deal, or if the Ukrainians are forced into a deal that they really don't want to make when they would prefer to fight on, the rest of the world will conclude that the Western world can't deliver anymore, and that will have bigger global implications. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Sean. The immediate prospects for Ukraine are not good, but the West has committed itself, absolutely committed itself, to prevailing in this crisis because it matters to the West's role in a very disordered world.
But it is interesting to hear that some of the political conversations now, particularly behind closed doors, you're hearing much more of a conversation about the future. This maritime coalition capability was all about the future, and all of a sudden it's less about today and more about tomorrow, and about where that compromise might lie at some stage in the near future.
And that word's I mean, this conflict matters. That's the point. I mean, the conflicts go on all over the world, and they're very nasty. The Gaza conflict is awful, but there's a general sense, I think, in Western capitals, this one, the Ukraine conflict, really matters. Now, that's what the leaders say, but the electorates in electoral years don't always feel that. But you know, geopolitically, this conflict really matters.
But even the president was saying the other day that actually Russia may have taken more land, but one of its aims was to stop NATO expanding. NATO has expanded. One of them was to make Russia great again. Russia isn't much diminished economically. And thirdly, Putin is actually indicted, can't travel. That doesn't look like a strategic success. So I think it can be painted as a tactical failure, but a strategic success.
Yeah, well, paint it that way in Africa. That's the point.
Right. I mean, but the language as well, and you raised Boris Johnson, because he said that they must fail, but also be seen to fail. And I guess if he's looking through this prism, he can't travel. He is not going to be able to do anything anytime soon, and NATO's got bigger. that could be seen as
I mean, there's Putin going to Abu Dhabi. You know, there is in Saudi Arabia. I mean, he's actually pushing against this sort of sense of outrage that he's got over the crisis of the Prigozhin coup, if that's what it was. He's actually now recovering. He's more confident than he was 6 months ago. And the danger is, again, although we can argue about the diminution of Russia as a result of this, it's how does it look to the global south? Because they're all standing off, waiting to see what happens.
And are we really concerned as well that it will give sucker encouragement to other authoritarian nations, of course, sure. China, if he's not pushed back entirely? This is the sort of the failure and seems to fail. If there was a compromise done, would that still be seen as, you know,
I think there's always a risk of that. The danger, we keep talking about China and Taiwan as the example here. I think if you look at global trade, China is enormously reliant on global trade for its prosperity. And actually, what's been happening with Russia, if it wasn't for its oil, nobody would deal with Russia at all now. So I think there are some really... Would China have expected the world to rally round, the West to rally round Ukraine the way it has? Probably not. So I do think we've got to be careful before swinging to one side or the other in this. I think pretty clearly Russia has suffered significantly for this conflict. Whether or not Ukraine will finally be able to liberate all its territory, as an analyst, I think that's highly unlikely. The question is, therefore, how much longer do you back it? And the domestic priorities, not only for the UK, the majority of Americans now don't see continued support for Ukraine. And bluntly, they may be right, because if all you're doing is supporting a war that sees more people die but the front lines not move, who is smart here? And actually, it's almost getting time for grand statesmanship to say, right, OK, a bit like the Winter War, where, you know, nations give up cede a part of their territory, but at least they win their sovereignty and their future. And it feels like we're closing in on that sort of opportunity.
Thought for you on the fighting, then, as a former airman. F-16s, always talked about. Are they going to come in 2024?
No. They may arrive in 2024, but what the point of your question is, if I put a squadron of F-16s, in fact, a station's worth of F-16s on the lawn of Kyiv, would they turn the course of the war? No, they would not. And that is not going to suddenly... That's a long-term proposition.
Michael, in terms of the fighting on the ground, then, what do you think it will be able to see in 2024?
Well, I think we'll see, I mean, in one sense, more of the same. So in one sense, it's a First World War battle. It's trenches and mud and boots on the ground, getting very muddy. And at the same time, it's going on in space, it's going on in cyberspace, it's going on in new technologies. So this is a war that stretches all of the definitions of the way warfare has developed. You know, the fundamental nature of warfare never changes, but the character of warfare changes all the time. And what we've seen in this war is something very different to everything we saw through the Cold War, and at the end of the Cold War is a conflict that goes upwards and downwards at the same time.
Well, thank you very much both for your expertise and knowledge. We're going to have plenty more coverage of the war in Ukraine throughout 2024, including more analysis from both Michael and Sean.